Hey there, this is Natalie, and in this video I want to take a very deep dive into the character of Hitogami, or the man god, from Mushoku Tensei. Now, I do already have a video that goes into his history, what happens with him in the story, and all of that stuff, but this is going to be a bit different to that. I want to go into the archetype and the real-world historical myths that kind of influenced the character, and also how Rifujin kind of used those influences to create something a little bit different. So this is more of a kind of meta-analysis of the character rather than a lore video. I do have character lore videos for Hitogami and a whole bunch of other characters in a playlist on my channel, so feel free to check those out as well. Naturally, to get into this stuff, I will need to include some spoilers for both Mushoku Tensei and Old Dragon's Tale. I'll be explaining the relevant stuff as I go, so if you haven't read Old Dragon's Tale, that'll be okay as long as you don't mind spoilers for it. If you do want to experience the story of Old Dragon's Tale, I do have a full reading of the entire thing, which you can get either by going to my Ko-fi page and downloading it as a 7.5 hour long audiobook. And you can get that even without donating anything. It and all of my other audiobook style readings of Mushoku Tensei and ReZero side content are free for everyone. But if you can afford it and want to support the channel, and especially if you're aware of some of my personal financial struggles I've talked about in previous videos, then you'll understand just how grateful I am if you do decide to support the channel in that way. Or if you prefer, there is a playlist on my channel that contains the full reading in installments, and with background music and all of that. So if you want it clean without ads or music or intros at the start every 2 chapters, then you can get the audiobook. If you prefer the YouTube experience, then there's a playlist there for you. But that's quite enough of me talking about my other content. Let's get into this topic. So, Hitogami, the man god, is a very good example of the Demiurge archetype, which is kind of the interpretation in fiction of the mythos of the Gnostics. Just as a quick point, this has nothing to do with the character Demiurge from Overlord, who is an example of a name from mythology being used in a light novel, but not really an example of the trope associated with that. So, who were the Gnostics? Well, they were effectively a diverse collection of ancient religious and philosophical groups, primarily from the 1st to 4th centuries AD. And these different groups are kind of held together under a set of core beliefs. So they weren't really a defined sect, much as you can say there are lots of different types of Buddhist, but they all share the same sort of core beliefs. It was the same with the Gnostics. They were spread out over diverse areas and, weren't really communicating with each other necessarily all that much. And their whole ethos is very much against organised religion anyway. So there are big differences historically in what one specific type of Gnostic might have believed compared with another. But their core belief was that salvation comes through gnosis. Gnosis just means knowledge, but in this context, it's a special secret knowledge or insight that was around the true nature of reality and the nature of humans. They held a distinct belief around the creation of the world we live in and the nature of humanity that contradicted the Abrahamic religions such as Judaism and the emerging Christianity of the time. Gnostics believed that the material world that we live in was not created by the perfect all-good God that Jesus describes in the New Testament, but by a lesser, often ignorant or even malevolent deity they called the Demiurge. This Demiurge was seen as distinct from the true, unknowable God. To them, humanity's problem wasn't sin or a need for redemption from sin, but being trapped in this flawed material world that is in many ways illusory. Our true selves, our divine spark or spirit, was seen as being imprisoned within our physical bodies. The path to liberation, to escaping this material prison and returning to the true God, was through acquiring that crucial gnosis. That is, understanding the true nature of this reality, the divine spark within us, and the fact that we've been living on Earth under the deception of the Demiurge. Their beliefs led to a wide range of practices and interpretations. Some of them rejected the material world entirely. Others saw it as something that they needed to transcend. Gnosticism wasn't a single unified religion, as I said, and although it did have its distinct mythos, it did have its distinct ideas about things like the role of Jesus Christ, who they believe was sent not to redeem humans of sin, but to teach them about the nature of reality and that the true kingdom of God was inside them all along, rather than something they had to obtain by appeasing the needs of the Demiurge, following organised religion, and all of that stuff. There was still a wide spectrum of different specific beliefs within Gnostics, but the very nature of their idea of the Demiurge and the different role of Jesus was naturally very challenging to the emerging Orthodox Christianity, which led to the suppression of the Gnostics and to their beliefs at the time being seen as very heretical. Now, there are certainly people today who believe aspects of Gnosticism, but that's not really what I want to get into here. I want to talk about its influence on literature and fiction, and very specifically Hitogami in Mushoku Tensei. So with that brief background on where this mythos comes from and who the Gnostics were, I'd like to now talk about more specifically what they believed about the Demiurge. This is very specifically the Gnostic meaning of the Demiurge in their mythology. There was an earlier use of the word Demiurge, which really just means craftsman, which was in Plato's work. And Plato's Demiurge is kind of a different concept. It's potentially related, but it's not really relevant to the mythology of the Demiurge, which is what I want to talk about here. I'm really just mentioning it in case you want to go and do more research on the Demiurge and come out with some stuff that relates to Plato as well. So in Gnostic cosmology, the Demiurge is essentially the creator of the material world that we inhabit. But the crucial distinction is that he's not the true ultimate supreme god. Instead, he's an imposter, a lesser, often flawed, and often even malevolent deity. He is the architect of this flawed world that we inhabit, and he traps people there in order to preside over them. This does actually align with what Hitogami originally intends to do in Old Dragon's Tale, but we'll come to how Rifujin took things in a different direction in just a moment. First, we need to know the Gnostic ideas about how the Demiurge came to be. Their myths do vary, but there is a common theme of him arising from an accidental error from the divine realm. So there is a true creator god who lives in the divine realm or pleroma. That is essentially the perfect state, the source of all other things, and very much that kind of unknowable, cosmic, eldritch kind of concept. And that perfect realm is inhabited by divine beings called eons. In many Gnostic myths, it was one of these eons, often Sophia, who represents wisdom, who falls into error and, without the consent of the creator god, inadvertently gives birth to the Demiurge. This Demiurge is usually born outside of the pleroma or divine realm in a void. And I'll show you how that's echoed in Mushoku Tensei's creation story in just a minute. But how do the Gnostics describe the personality of the Demiurge? Well, generally he's portrayed as ignorant, arrogant, petulant, jealous, flawed in a very human type of way. He often believes himself to be the only god, or he aspires to be the only god, and that there is no other god beside him. So when people who follow the Abrahamic religions see their god declare this, within those belief systems that is taken as a truth, but in the Gnostic context it is taken as a fundamental delusion. The Demiurge is often depicted as short-sighted. He's unable to perceive the true higher divine reality from which he originated. He crafts the material world and humanity itself, often in an imperfect or flawed way, just because that's the limit of his understanding. He sets up laws and rules, believing them to be absolute, unaware that there is a higher truth beyond his creation. So the Demiurge isn't a force of ultimate evil in the same way you might think of a devil or a Satan. He's instead a very flawed blunderer. He's powerful, but he's limited and deluded. And he possesses many human personality traits that we would see as weak or basic or petty or even pitiable. And he traps the divine sparks, or us in terms of the Gnostic beliefs, in a world where those kinds of attributes dominate, and we can no longer recognize the divinity of the pleroma that's inside ourselves, because we're now distracted by the very human things and flaws and problems of the very human world created by this very human imposter god. Which really makes the name man god or Hitogami just perfect for Rifujin's take on this kind of character archetype. But Rifujin didn't just take the concept of the Demiurge and use that as the big bad for his story. When we see this character in Old Dragon's Tale, he is very much the Demiurge archetype, but at the end of that story, the intervention of the dragon god seals him within his void, which means that what we see happen next, that is all of the lore and the actual story of Mushoku Tensei, which is all set in the world that emerged, or you could say was created, by Hitogami's actions, happens with Hitogami only able to influence the world in certain ways. So rather than the Gnostic Demiurge, who is able to control the people in his world very directly, and whose main reason for being is to rule over these people and be that one true god, Rifujin gives us a world where his influence is very limited and his main goal is simply not to be killed, taking him in an even more petty and pathetic direction. The world Mushoku Tensei is set in can be considered a kind of what-if scenario for a universe where a Demiurge was successful in creating a world and trapping people within it, but only partially successful overall. So to elaborate on that, Old Dragon's Tale gives us effectively the rise of the Demiurge, Hitogami. And even the creation story that Rifujin wrote, which is in chapter 2 of Old Dragon's Tale, and I'll read it briefly to you in just a moment, is perfectly in line with the Gnostic Demiurge archetype. It says, "Once upon a time there was a god. Let's call him the creator god. He was old. He'd lived through eons and created countless worlds, but both his body and mind had reached their limit. He knew his death was near. As his final task, he decided to create one more world. However, he hadn't created a world in a long time, perhaps because of this long hiatus, or perhaps because his faculties were declining. The world he created was terribly distorted and unbalanced. He no longer had the power to properly create a world. However, he had experience from creating many worlds before, so he created another world. Just like the first one, it was also distorted. Without hesitation, he continued creating world after world. In this way, he created 6 worlds. A world of dragons, where the heavens and earth were inverted, inhabited by a race of immense power. A world of demons, filled with swirling poison and miasma, inhabited by a race with strong, resilient bodies. A world of dense forests and mountains, inhabited by a race with sharp claws and keen senses. A world rich in life under the sea, inhabited by a race with gills, fins and scales. A world of floating landmasses in the sky, inhabited by a race that could freely soar through the skies with their wings. A world of plains and grasslands, inhabited by a race with weak bodies, but superior intellect. Each of these worlds was warped. Any one of them on its own would collapse because they were too unbalanced. So, the god fused the worlds together. By closely connecting the 6 worlds, he achieved balance. Thus, one world was created. But the god was not satisfied with just that. The 6 worlds barely maintained their balance by being stuck to each other, but they required management until they stabilized and settled and became stable. The god used the last of his strength to split his own body. From his divided body, he created beings to manage the precariously balanced worlds, assigning each to a world. And then, the god died. What happened after his death, no one knows. Perhaps the creator god never existed in the first place. After all, no one had ever seen him. What remained were the 6 beings, one for each world and each race. Since they were fragments of the god, we'll call them gods. Each god descended into their respective world. They found their people, huddling together in their vast worlds, and worked to help them prosper. However, not all of the world's races prospered smoothly. In particular, the world of dragons and the world of demons remained primitive for a long time. The long-lived, powerful and robust beings in those worlds could survive without developing civilizations. Yet, both the dragon world and the demon world were harsh environments. In such a world, teeming with vicious dragons and beasts, seizing dominance was no easy feat. Despite having the power to rule their worlds, the dragon and demon races remained stagnant. And because of that, perhaps one god felt pity for them. Or maybe it was impatience, but one of the gods made a proposal. Why don't we meet regularly and hold discussions? Let's exchange information about our worlds and use it to help each other prosper. This god was the human god, the deity of the human world. Humans had the shortest lifespans and were the weakest. Most of them died before they even lived for 10 years, succumbing to illness or injury. However, the human world was not a harsh one, but rather abundant with nature and full of resources and food. As a result, the human race prospered faster than any other. A moderately challenging environment fostered wisdom, and rapid generational change enriched their knowledge. The quicker a race prospers, the faster it accumulates the knowledge and wisdom it needs. The human god shared this knowledge with the other gods. Thanks to this, the dragon folk and demons learned many things, starting with language and writing, to the knowledge of living in groups and establishing order. These things brought the light of civilization to races that once lived no differently from beasts. Of course, the other races didn't just receive. They shared their own strengths with the humans as well. The dragon folk taught humans how to harness the power within their bodies. The demons taught humans how to alter their bodies to withstand such power. The beast folk taught humans how to tame and live alongside savage creatures. The sea folk taught humans how to filter water and keep it pure. The sky folk taught humans how to read the winds and control the weather. The 6 worlds supported each other, aiming for prosperity together. Though the human world, with its rapid renewal, flourished the most, every world thrived in its own way. All the gods believed that their prosperity would continue for thousands or tens of thousands of years without end. None of them knew at the time. Not the 6 gods, nor perhaps even the creator god. that in the shadows of the worlds, a single entity had quietly been born. Now, that was from Lucius Seneca's translation, which is fairly new, but in the older translation that I read previously in my audiobook and the playlist that you can find on my channel, it actually said that this entity was born in the void, where Lucius has used the shadow of the worlds. So either way, we have that concept similar to the Gnostic origin of the Demiurge. And here it's ominously describing the birth of Hitogami, who will come and usurp the position of the human god, who we see speaking in that excerpt and agreeing with the other gods to share knowledge, and who we then see through the developments in Old Dragon's Tale, causing the ultimate destruction of all of the worlds except for the human world, which he then traps the remaining survivors of every race in, causing it to become this new sort of merged, flawed version of all of the worlds put together. And that's the world that Mushoku Tensei is set in. So we have all of the concepts from the Gnostic Demiurge story, but with other cool stuff like dragon race people and beastmen and things like that into the bargain. But because the dragon god was able to successfully seal Hitogami and send his son Orsted into the future to take him on and ultimately kill him, the Hitogami we see getting to actually exist in this new world that he's created is very different from the Demiurge that the Gnostics believed was influencing our human world. The Gnostics believed that the Demiurge used beings called archons to control and manipulate the people living on the earth, with all kinds of means to keep them distracted from their true selves. Everything from politics and wars to entertainment, and of course organised religion, were all governed by these archons. They were the Demiurge's enforcers, who aimed to keep the people of the world asleep to the knowledge that they contained this divine spark from the Pleroma, or the original creator god. In modern times, people might say that these archons could be the concept of the elites, whether it's in fields like politics or technology, who seem to be distracting humans with bread and circuses and causing divisions wherever they want to. Just to give you an idea of how those kind of Gnostic ideas are making something of a comeback in some ways today. But Hitogami doesn't have the power to install these archons, and being trapped in his void and concerned only with his own survival, he no longer even has the motivation to rule over the world, which in turn limits him further, only being able to see the futures of a few humans at a time because he's so focused on his own, and using his influence over those humans simply to try to prevent his own death. In this scenario, the Demiurge no longer cares about things like the organised religions in the world he's created. You know, there's the Millis Church and various other faiths, and they all have things going on between them, but none of that is really of concern to the Demiurge. He doesn't really care if people find arcane knowledge about things like teleportation and stuff like that, as long as none of it contributes to a situation where he gets killed. Most people in the setting don't have any idea that he exists, not as the imposter Demiurge, but even as the god of that world. They've never heard of him, and they certainly don't pray to him or believe that he's the key to giving them everlasting life or any of the things that they want, which is an interesting scenario to use as a premise for a world, for a fictional setting. Rather than exploring a world where what the Gnostics believed was true and still is, Rifujin instead uses a world where what the Gnostics believed was the origin of his big bad, but not the current state. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. There are certainly ways to take this idea of looking at the Gnostic myth and Mushoku Tensei further. For instance, we could talk about how Laplace maybe takes a similar role to Jesus's role in the Gnostic myth, though naturally with very different outcomes due to the changes Rifujin made to the Demiurge's situation at the end of Old Dragon's Tale. And if you want a second part to this where I waffle on about that, then let me know. I'm really not sure how much people are going to be interested in this style of analysis, so, I wanted to try it out with this video and see what people thought. But if you do find this interesting and want to talk about it some more, then engage with me down in the comments or on X, and we'll see what we can do. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you again very soon.